Part 1. How Mountain Men Built Cabins from Scratch, and more. Hey guys, tonight we're going to settle into something slow, steady, and a little bit earthy. Nothing dramatic, nothing rushed, just you, your blanket, and the strangely soothing saga of men with questionable hygiene, mediocre carpentry skills, and a whole lot of stubbornness. Yes, we're talking about mountain men. So dim the lights, get comfortable, and let's wander very slowly into the wilderness of the early 1800s, a place where beards were mandatory, soap was optional, and the word luxury usually meant owning 2 socks instead of 1. Now, when we think of mountain men today, most people picture some rugged loner with a rifle slung over his shoulder, trudging stoically through snow. Or maybe they imagine Grizzly Adams, petting a bear like it's just a really big Labrador. Reality? Well, kind of, but also not. Because most mountain men were just regular guys who decided farming was boring, cities were crowded, and the woods offered them an exciting new opportunity: total isolation combined with frostbite. And before they could do any of that, they had to build something that at least pretended to be a house, which usually meant the iconic log cabin. So let's start with the basics. Building a cabin from scratch sounds rustic and romantic. In reality, it was about as fun as trying to assemble IKEA furniture without instructions, but in freezing temperatures and with actual wolves watching you from the tree line. The first step, pick your spot. You didn't want to just plop a cabin down anywhere. Ideally, you wanted somewhere flattish, not directly in a swamp, and close to a water source, because carrying buckets of water uphill every day is the kind of thing that makes a man start questioning his life choices real fast. But also not too close to the water, because rivers flood, and nobody wants to wake up floating on their straw mattress, waving goodbye to the cabin they spent 3 weeks sweating over. So yeah, the dream location was flat, near but not too near water, with enough trees nearby to chop down, but not so many that you're living in permanent shade like some sort of woodland goblin. Once you had your spot, it was time to chop trees. And here's the thing, mountain men were picky about their logs. They didn't want just any old tree. They wanted straight, tall, relatively uniform logs that would stack neatly. Pine was popular, cedar if you could get it, something that wouldn't rot immediately, because nobody likes waking up to find the wall crumbling into mulch. So yeah, by the time you were done collecting logs, your arms were basically useless noodles, and you'd be questioning why you didn't just stay back east and become a tailor. Okay, so you've got your logs. Now it's time to drag them to the building site. This was often done by rolling them, or if you were lucky, getting a mule to help. If not, well, congratulations, you're the mule now. Then came the stacking, which sounds simple: stack logs on top of each other. Done, right? Except you had to notch each log, cutting little grooves so they'd fit snugly together at the corners. Too shallow, and the logs wobbled. Too deep, and congratulations, you just weakened the entire structure. The result, if done poorly, was a cabin that looked fine on day 1, but collapsed dramatically the first time a raccoon leaned on it. And then, of course, were the gaps. Logs aren't perfect puzzle pieces. There were always spaces between them, and those spaces let in drafts. So mountain men invented the thrilling art of chinking, which basically means stuffing moss, mud, clay, straw, or whatever vaguely sticky substance you could find into the cracks. It was kind of like medieval caulking, if caulking smelled like wet grass and crumbled every time you touched it. But hey, it worked, more or less.
Let's float gently now to the roof. The roof was usually made of split logs, shingles if you were fancy, or just slabs of bark. Anything to keep the rain out. Of course, keeping the rain out was a generous phrase. Most cabins leaked. Some leaked so badly that the inside of the cabin became a sort of permanent mud pit. Which sounds cozy until you remember these people didn't own extra socks. Doors were often nothing more than a couple of planks tied together, hung on leather hinges. Windows? Don't be ridiculous. Glass was expensive, fragile, and definitely not being carried over mountains. If you wanted light, you left a hole in the wall. If you wanted ventilation, congratulations, that hole also did the trick. Inside, the cabin was, let's call it minimalist. A dirt floor, maybe covered with animal hides. A single bed frame, if the builder had enough patience. Otherwise, everyone just slept on straw pallets that smelled like, well, exactly what you think they smelled like. A fireplace was essential, of course. No fireplace meant no cooking and no heat. And mountain winters weren't the kind you could just tough out. So fireplaces were built from stacked stone, or sometimes mud and clay, which meant they had about a 50% chance of collapsing dramatically at least once during the winter. Nothing says cozy like having your fireplace fall over in the middle of the night. Now, here's the thing. Mountain men didn't always live alone. Sometimes they teamed up. 2 or 3 guys might build a cabin together, which made the process faster, but also meant sharing a one-room shack with 2 other sweaty dudes all winter. Imagine the smell. It's like a candle scent no one ever asked for. Oh, do wet wool and regret. And if a mountain man actually had a wife or family, which some did, though most women took one look at the cabin and immediately regretted all their life choices, they'd squeeze everyone into that same tiny space. Babies, kids, adults, maybe a dog. It was basically a human sardine can, except colder. So why did they do this? Why choose to live in drafty cabins with mud walls and raccoon roommates? The answer, of course, was beaver hats. Yes, the global fashion industry was directly responsible for thousands of men freezing in the Rockies. In the early 1800s, wealthy Europeans and Americans were obsessed with beaver felt hats. Sleek, stylish, and very, very dead beaver. Mountain men were the ones trapping those beavers, skinning them and selling the pelts to fur companies. Cabins weren't really about comfort. They were about survival while you waited for trapping season. So the cabin wasn't a dream home. It was more like a glorified storage shed with a bed. A place to keep you alive just long enough to catch enough beaver to afford, well, another year of exactly the same thing. Now, let's glide over for a moment to the personalities of these mountain men. Because while the cabins may have been bland, the men themselves were often eccentric. Take Jedediah Smith, famous trapper, explorer, and man with a reputation for being deeply religious, which sounds wholesome until you realize he basically dragged a Bible into the middle of the wilderness and lectured other trappers about their sinful ways, while they were all trying not to die of dysentery. Or Hugh Glass. Yes, the same guy Leonardo DiCaprio played in The Revenant. Mauled by a bear, crawled 200 miles to safety, and then went right back to trapping, as if being eaten alive was just a minor inconvenience. That's dedication, or insanity. Hard to tell. Then there were the more colorful ones, like Jim Bridger, who told tall tales so elaborate that people weren't sure if he was a genius storyteller or just permanently concussed. He once claimed he'd discovered a petrified forest where the trees were literally stone and a river that ran with fish made of gold. Spoiler, he had not, but everyone nodded politely because correcting Jim Bridger was probably a full-time job. Let's drift back to cabins for one last detail. Despite their roughness, some cabins did eventually evolve into something nicer. A few mountain men stayed long enough in one place to add extra rooms, real floors, even proper furniture. And some of those cabins, believe it or not, still stand today. You can actually visit them, assuming your idea of a fun vacation is staring at a pile of logs while your tour guide explains how much it smelled like wet moss back in 1825. So the legacy of these cabins isn't architectural beauty, it's endurance. They represent the sheer stubbornness of men who decided, yes, I will live in a box of logs filled with mud and bugs, and I will call it home. And in a way, that stubbornness is weirdly admirable, or maybe just deeply questionable. Either way, it makes for a soothing story. That feels like a good place to pause. But don't worry, we're just getting started. Because next, we'll wander deeper into the lives of these men, their habits, their quirks, their utterly baffling choices, and maybe even how they tried to keep themselves entertained in a cabin with nothing but a fire, some pelts, and a growing sense of regret. Part 2. The Strange Daily Lives of Mountain Men. Hey again. So you've built your log cabin, you've stuffed mud between the cracks, you've convinced yourself that the constant dripping from the roof is atmospheric rather than miserable. Now comes the next challenge, actually living in it. Because once the logs are stacked and the fireplace is hopefully functional, the mountain man's day-to-day life was a mix of survival, boredom, and questionable culinary experiments, and a whole lot of talking to yourself. Let's start with food. What did these guys eat way out in the wilderness? Spoiler, it wasn't gourmet. The diet of a typical mountain man was heavy on whatever animal was unlucky enough to wander by. Deer, elk, buffalo, rabbits, squirrels. If it moved, you could eat it. If it didn't move, well, you might still eat it if you were desperate enough. Cooking was simple. Meat got roasted on a stick or boiled in a pot if you were one of the lucky ones who actually owned a pot. Frying pans were a luxury. Plates? The ground worked fine. And seasoning was more of a theoretical concept. Salt was valuable, pepper even more so. Most of the time it was just plain meat. When animals weren't cooperating, mountain men turned to plants. Roots, berries, nuts, basically a scavenger's buffet. Sometimes they gathered wild onions or cattail roots. Sometimes they made a kind of flour from acorns, though that involved soaking them forever to wash out the bitterness. Imagine the taste of cardboard soaked in swamp water, and you're in the right ballpark. And then, of course, there was pemmican, the survival food of choice, borrowed, quite wisely, from native traditions. Pemmican was dried meat pounded into powder, mixed with fat and sometimes berries. It could last for months, maybe even years, which was good, because it was about as appetizing as eating a candle. Still, it kept you alive, and in the mountains, that was all that mattered. But let's be honest, life wasn't just about hunting and eating. There were long, long hours of sitting inside that tiny log cabin, listening to the wind and wondering if your toes would fall off before spring. So what did mountain men do all day? Well, not much. They mended their gear, sharpened their knives, repaired traps, whittled wood into vague shapes. Some men carved little figurines or tools just to pass the time. Others made their own moccasins, sewing scraps of leather into shoes that, frankly, looked like sad potato sacks, but worked well enough. Reading was rare. Most mountain men weren't lugging around a library.
If you had a Bible, you were already doing better than most. If you were literate at all, you might scratch notes in a journal, though plenty of men just didn't. So instead, they talked. A lot. To each other when there were companions, to themselves when there weren't. Imagine months of near silence, punctuated only by the sound of your own muttering. No wonder so many trappers became known for their eccentricities. Isolation does things to a person. Speaking of eccentricities, mountain men had plenty. Some wore patchwork outfits made of animal hides, stitched together so haphazardly they looked like walking rugs. Others decorated their clothing with beads, feathers, or fringe, partly borrowed from native styles, partly just because they were bored and had nothing else to do. And then there was hygiene, or rather the absence of it. Bathing was not a daily activity, or a weekly one, sometimes not even monthly. Cold water, no soap, no privacy. It just wasn't worth it. So mountain men stank. Badly. One early traveler remarked that you could often smell a trapper before you saw him, which is not the legacy most men want to leave behind. Beards, of course, were mandatory. Not stylish, groomed beards. Wild, scraggly, bird's nest beards that probably hid entire ecosystems. Combine that with greasy hair and animal hide clothing, and you've got the picture. Mountain men were basically walking cautionary tales about why indoor plumbing is the greatest invention in history. Now, loneliness. This is where things get a little sad. Because despite the rugged, manly image, mountain men were often desperately lonely. Think about it. Months at a time stuck in the wilderness. Maybe you had a partner, maybe you didn't. Even if you did, they might be gone for days, off checking traps. Social life was minimal. When gatherings did happen, usually at annual rendezvous, they were wild. Imagine hundreds of trappers flooding into one valley, trading pelts, drinking heavily, gambling, shouting, wrestling, and generally acting like men who hadn't seen civilization, or soap, for 12 months. It was basically spring break, except with more beaver pelts and fewer Instagram stories. But the other 11 months of the year, silence. Endless silence. Which is probably why so many mountain men ended up befriending their dogs, or occasionally random wild animals. Pet ravens, pet foxes, pet whatever wandered into the cabin and didn't immediately get eaten. Now let's drift to relationships. Because yes, mountain men sometimes had wives and families. And here's where the story gets complicated. Most women willing to live in the Rockies were Native American. Trappers often married into local tribes, sometimes for love, sometimes as alliances, sometimes just because it was practical. A native wife could help with food, clothing, and survival skills, things the average half-starved beaver trapper was pretty bad at. These marriages were often respected within the community, but back in the civilized East, they were frowned upon, which meant some mountain men lived in this weird limbo, caught between two worlds, belonging fully to neither. Still, many of these marriages were genuine. Children were born, families were raised in those drafty little cabins, and while survival was hard, there was at least companionship, which is more than you could say for the guy mumbling to his pet raccoon in the corner. And speaking of children, what was life like for kids in a mountain man cabin? Let's just say, not cozy. Babies were swaddled in furs, toddlers ran barefoot on dirt floors. Playtime was basically throwing rocks or poking at the fire until somebody shouted at you. Education was non-existent unless your parents happened to be literate, which wasn't common. But kids were tough. They had to be. By the time they were 10, they might already be setting traps, hauling water, or helping skin animals. Childhood was short, and the wilderness didn't care if you were ready for adulthood or not. We should also talk about weather, because if the cabin was your shelter, the weather was your constant enemy. Winters in the Rockies were brutal. Snow piled up to the windows. Temperatures dropped so low that fires barely kept you warm. Men huddled under piles of hides, praying spring would come before they froze solid. Summers weren't much kinder. Swarms of mosquitoes, heat that turned cabins into ovens, thunderstorms that blew holes in your leaky roof, and of course, floods, fire wilds, and the occasional bear deciding your food supply was actually its food supply. Basically, every season had a fresh way to remind mountain men that maybe, just maybe, life would have been easier if they'd stuck with farming turnips back east. Let's float briefly into entertainment. Because, believe it or not, mountain men did find ways to amuse themselves. Music was popular, if you could call it that. Some men carried fiddles. Others made flutes or drums out of whatever was lying around. Singing was common, though not necessarily pleasant. Imagine a group of half-starved trappers howling out old folk songs in a smoky cabin. More haunting than harmonious.
Games were another pastime. Cards, dice, or simple gambling with stones and sticks. Anything to kill time. Storytelling, of course, was huge, and that's where characters like Jim Bridger really shined, spinning tales that blurred the line between fact and fiction so hard that people gave up asking for clarification. Now, let's not forget about health, because mountain men were not, shall we say, paragons of wellness. Scurvy was a real risk in the winter, when fresh food was scarce. Malnutrition was common. Accidents were constant. Axe injuries, gun misfires, broken bones from slipping on ice. And doctors? Forget it. You patched yourself up, or you didn't. Some men carried little kits with laudanum or whiskey for pain relief. Others just gritted their teeth, which explains the high mortality rate. Honestly, if you made it to 40 as a mountain man, congratulations. You were basically an elder statesman of the wilderness. And yet, despite all the hardship, the smell, the loneliness, many of these men chose this life, chose it again and again, year after year. Why? Freedom. For all its misery, the wilderness offered something the cities didn't. No bosses, no landlords, no endless rows of neighbors telling you how to live, just you, your cabin, your traps, and the wide open silence of the mountains. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't comfortable, but for a certain type of man, it was irresistible. So, here we are. A tiny log cabin, half collapsing, filled with the smell of smoke, hides, and unwashed socks. A man hunched by the fire, sharpening a knife. Outside, snow falls silently, covering the roof, the trees, the world. It's bleak, it's lonely, it's strangely peaceful, and it's exactly where the mountain man wanted to be. We'll let that image settle for a moment, because in part 3, we're going to wander into the social side of things. Those wild annual rendezvous, the chaotic trading economy of beaver pelts, and how the mountain men slowly disappeared when the fashion world decided beaver hats were so last season. But that comes next. Part 3, beaver hats, rendezvous, and the slow decline. All right, so far we've built the cabin, we've survived a winter of questionable cuisine and questionable hygiene, we've stared at the fire until our eyeballs practically froze. But life in the mountains wasn't always just solitary brooding in a log box. Once a year, or maybe once every couple years, something different happened. The mountain men came together. In an event that was part business meeting, part drunken carnival, part demolition derby. It was called the Rendezvous. Now, the annual rendezvous was basically the highlight of the mountain man calendar. Trappers, traders, native families, curious travelers, they all converged in one big valley, usually somewhere in modern-day Wyoming or Utah. Imagine hundreds of filthy, unshaven men staggering into camp after months of isolation, some dragging packs of beaver pelts, some dragging themselves, all of them eager for one thing: trade. Because remember,
Mountain men weren't living in the woods for fun. They were there to make money. Beaver pelts were the currency of the day, and the rendezvous was where you turned your giant stack of soggy pelts into actual supplies. Or, if you weren't wise, into several days of binge drinking that ended with you owning nothing but a hangover. Here's how it worked. Big fur companies, like the Rocky Mountain Fur Company, organized these gatherings. They brought wagons full of goods from St. Louis: rifles, gunpowder, kettles, blankets, knives, beads, tobacco, whiskey, and basically anything else a mountain man had been wishing he'd had while stuck in his cabin. Trappers showed up with bundles of pelts. A single beaver skin could fetch several dollars, which doesn't sound like much now, but at the time it was real money, enough to keep you supplied for another season, if you spent wisely. Spoiler, they usually didn't. Because the rendezvous wasn't just a trading fair, it was also, let's call it, a festival of questionable decisions. Picture this. A wide-open meadow, dotted with tents and campfires, mountains looming in the background. Hundreds of filthy, unshaven men milling about, dressed in patched hides, half drunk on bad whiskey, shouting over each other about prices. Over here, a man is bartering pelts for a new rifle. Over there, two trappers are wrestling in the mud for no reason anyone remembers. Someone's firing a gun into the air. Someone else is passed out under a wagon. A fiddler sawing away at a tune while half a dozen guys are trying to dance in moccasins. It was chaos, but it was glorious chaos. For men who'd spent months alone talking only to their dogs, the rendezvous was a chance to blow off all the pent-up energy in one wild week. Of course, not all the chaos was fun. Disputes over trade prices often turned violent. Gambling was rampant, and not a few men lost entire years' worth of pelts in one unlucky dice roll. Whiskey flowed like water, and let's just say mountain men weren't exactly known for moderation.
Now, let's float gently to the heart of all this, the beaver hat. Because without the beaver hat, none of this would have happened. In the 17th and 18th centuries, wealthy Europeans decided that nothing said classy quite like a hat made of beaver felt. The fur was durable, waterproof, and had a nice sheen once processed. So beaver hats became the fashion accessory. Kings wore them, merchants wore them. Basically, if you wanted to look respectable, you stuck a beaver on your head. By the early 1800s, demand was so high that beaver populations in Europe had been decimated. So, the focus shifted to North America. Cue the rise of the fur trade, and cue a whole wave of scruffy men trudging into the Rockies to trap beavers until their fingers froze. The economics were simple. Beaver pelts went east. Hats went west. Money trickled back to the trappers, minus a hefty cut for the fur companies. And for a few decades, it was wildly profitable. But here's the catch. Fashion is fickle. Around the 1830s, silk hats started becoming trendy. Lighter, shinier, fancier. Suddenly, the beaver hat looked old-fashioned. And just like that, centuries of demand began to collapse. The result? The mountain man era didn't last long. Maybe 20 or 30 golden years. By the 1840s, the rendezvous shrank. Companies pulled out. Prices for pelts dropped. And trappers who'd once been rolling in whiskey and questionable gambling debts suddenly found themselves broke. Some adapted. They became guides for settlers heading west along the Oregon Trail. Others went into the army or became scouts. A few just stayed in the wilderness, refusing to leave, clinging to the life of the cabin even as the world moved on. But the glory days of the mountain man were gone, all because Parisian gentlemen decided silk looked sleeker. It's almost poetic. The entire frontier economy undone by a shift in hats. Now, before we drift into the end of this lifestyle, let's pause to consider the legacy of the rendezvous. Because while the mountain men themselves faded, their image lingered. Writers in the late 1800s romanticized them as rugged pioneers. Painters like Alfred Jacob Miller captured scenes of the rendezvous in glowing colors, turning what was essentially a muddy, drunken trade fair into a kind of heroic wilderness jamboree. And later, Hollywood took that image and ran with it,
giving us movies where mountain men were noble loners, taming the wilderness with grit and wisdom, which is hilarious considering most of them spent their actual days swatting mosquitoes and trying not to starve. So, to recap gently, the rendezvous was the party, the beaver hat was the reason, and the decline was inevitable. But the story doesn't quite end here, because mountain men didn't just vanish when the pelts dried up. Some became legends in their own right. Others lived long enough to see wagons and railroads replace their lonely trails. And their cabins, those drafty little log boxes, sometimes became the seeds of actual towns. Let's drift for a moment to the image of one of the last great rendezvous in the 1840s. The meadow is still full, but not as full as before. Traders count their profits, quietly aware they might not come back next year. The trappers drink and gamble, but in the back of their minds there's a whisper of uncertainty. The world is changing. The fashion is changing, and soon their cabins will stand empty, their traps rusting by the river. It's a strange kind of twilight. The end of an era, not with a bang, but with a slow shrug of indifference from the fashion world. And maybe that's fitting. Because for all their noise and wildness, mountain men were always a little bit temporary. Ghosts of the wilderness, leaving behind nothing but stories, and the occasional pile of logs still clinging together in the woods. That's where we'll pause this time, because in part 4, we're going to float through the individual characters again, Jedediah Smith, Jim Bridger, Hugh Glass, digging into their quirks, their disasters, and why history remembers them as legends when in reality they were just exhausted men trying to make rent in the form of beaver skins.
Part 4. Smoke, Fire, and the Strange Art of Not Freezing to Death. So, let's talk fireplaces, because if you thought cabin building was tough, just wait until you have to heat the thing without setting it on fire. Fireplaces in mountain cabins weren't the elegant marble affairs you might see in a Victorian mansion. No, these were more like a hole in the wall lined with rocks, with a generous side of trial and error. The hearth was usually stacked stone, sometimes just gathered river rocks held together with mud mortar. And yes, that mortar had a bad habit of cracking whenever it got too hot, which meant little chunks occasionally dropped into your beans. Nothing says fine dining quite like a spoonful of grit. Chimneys were an adventure all by themselves. The simplest version was literally a hole in the roof, which worked, kind of. It also let in rain, snow, and the occasional curious bird. The slightly fancier option was a stick and mud chimney. Sticks stacked up like a log cabin and plastered over with clay. And if that sounds like a structure that would randomly burst into flames, congratulations, you've caught on quickly. Chimneys were one of the main reasons cabins burned down in their first winter. Inside, the fireplace was rarely just for warmth. It was the heart of the home, your heater, stove, oven, light source, and emergency clothes dryer. Imagine every single thing in your daily life depending on whether or not you could keep a small pile of twigs smoldering. Romantic, yes. Also exhausting. And the smoke. Oh, the smoke. Even with a chimney, cabins tended to fill up with it, especially if the wind shifted or the chimney was clogged with soot. Mountain men didn't exactly have chimney sweeps on speed dial, so their solution was to just open a door and wave it out. Some cabins never really cleared properly, leaving the walls blackened and lungs wheezing. Early visitors often described mountain cabins as having a permanent haze, which sounds cozy until you realize you're basically living in a slow barbecue pit. Sleeping arrangements added to the fun. Most cabins had a single room, so if you had guests, congratulations, you all got to sleep together in one smoky space, noses stuffed into blankets while somebody snored like a dying moose. Privacy was not really on the menu. Now let's glide gently over to another problem, keeping food edible when your pantry was basically the open air.